Tantor Audio presents Secrets from the Eating Lab, The Science of Weight Loss, The Myth of Willpower, and Why You Should Never Diet Again, by Traci Mann, Ph.D. Narrated by Donna Postel. Preface. You study self-control? You should study me. I have great self-control. Nobody, ever. There is no sign on the door of the Health and Eating Lab at the University of Minnesota. That's my lab, and if I want to learn about people's eating habits, I can't let on that I am studying, or even noticing, what people are eating. It would make them self-conscious and stop them from eating the way they normally do. Instead, my students and I tell our research participants that we are studying other things entirely, such as their memory or their moods or how they communicate with their friends. But being the hospitable people we are, we just happen to offer them some snacks while we study them. They have no idea that it's what they do with those snacks that we're really studying. For more than 20 years, I have been doing research on eating, both with sneaky studies in my eating lab on campus and in that other eating lab known as the real world, where I have studied dieters going about their normal daily routines, kids eating in school cafeterias, visitors to the annual feeding frenzy that is the Minnesota State Fair, and even astronauts on the International Space Station. Much to my surprise, I've learned that nearly everything I thought was true about eating was false, including the 3 pillars of the commercial diet industry: that diets work, that dieting is good for you, and that obesity is deadly. The truth is that diets do not work and may be bad for you, and obesity is not going to kill you. I also learned that, despite what most people assume, a lack of self-control is not why people become fat, and harnessing willpower is not the way to become thin. Along the way, I've also learned that many people have a vested interest in all of us believing those things are true. The obesity research community, in particular, is not delighted that my students and I dare to question their 3 sacred cows. I've had a well-known diet researcher publicly accuse my young graduate student of doing a disservice to the field by suggesting that diets don't lead to long-term weight loss. I've gotten such vitriolic reviews of manuscripts that journal editors have called me before sending the reviews to prepare me for what I was about to read. I've had journal editors unable to find scholars willing to provide reviews of my work, even negative reviews, out of fear of getting involved in a controversy. And I've received lots of hostile and decidedly non-scholarly feedback when I've spoken up about these things in the media. Some people discount my research by suggesting I must be a bitter fat person, as if fat people cannot be scientists. One online commenter said I was just looking for an excuse to continue stuffing myself like a Thanksgiving turkey. I'm not obese, but I am a science nerd, obsessed with research methods and data, and the results of my studies don't lie or have anything to do with what I weigh. I can't ignore them, and I do not want to, because my research points the way to living a healthy life without suggesting that dieting is the answer. And that way to living a healthier life is what I'll share with you in this book. In Part 1, I'll share the research that proves diets don't lead to long-term weight loss and explain why this is so. If you lost a lot of weight and then gained it back, it is not because you lack self-control. In fact, I suspect you used more self-control than the people who accuse you of not having any. But it doesn't matter either way. Self-control is not the problem, and harnessing it is not the solution. In Part 2, I will make the case that diets are neither harmless nor necessary for optimal health, and that most people simply should not go on restrictive diets. My argument is based on the scientific criteria doctors use when they decide whether to recommend treatments, such as drugs, to patients for other conditions. Does the treatment work? Is it safe? Does it have side effects? For some reason, people rarely ask these questions before urging everyone to diet, but my students and I ask them, and the answers are clear. No, not necessarily. Yes. I understand that we all have an image in our mind about what we want to weigh. The problem is that, for many of us, that image is outside of our biologically set weight range. It is possible to maintain a weight outside that range. A small minority of dieters does. But to do so, you would have to make weight maintenance the central focus of your life. Above all others, including your relationships with your family and friends, your work, and your emotional well-being. It would be a life of agonizing self-denial. And for what purpose? Instead, I suggest we aim to live at the low end of our set weight range, which is our leanest, livable weight. At that weight, you can be happy and healthy, and you can maintain it without making it your life's work. In Part 3, we will look at 12 scientifically supported strategies for painlessly getting to that weight and staying there. These strategies don't involve calorie restriction or require willpower, because relying on willpower is foolhardy, and this is not a diet. Remember, I run an eating lab, not a dieting lab. You won't find this set of strategies elsewhere, because most of them are based on the research conducted in my lab over the last 2 decades. Not only will the results of this research surprise you, but I suspect the methods we use in these studies will as well. A rule of thumb in my lab is that if there is a fun way to do a study and a boring way to do a study, we go with the fun way. And as we've learned, there's always a fun way. But rest assured, the methodology we use is rigorous. In fact, the goofier the methods, the more rigorous the study needs to be to get published in leading academic journals, as these studies are. Finally, once you are effortlessly maintaining your leanest livable weight, in Part 4, I'll urge you to forget about the numbers on the scale and get on with your life. That means you need to forget about other people's weight, too. Rebel against our weight-obsessed culture by fighting weight stigma, and shift the focus to your health and well-being instead of your weight. I'll introduce you to the reasonable, yet oddly unnoticed notion that doing healthy things is healthy, whether or not they make you model thin. Let's get started. Part 1. Why Diets Fail You. Chapter 1. Diets Don't Work. Diets don't work. There, I said it. Maybe that's not what you wanted me to say, but I'm here to tell you the truth, according to science, without sugarcoating it. Like most simple-sounding scientific points, of course, it is more complicated than it seems. The reason for the complexity comes from the word work. What you mean when you think of a diet working is not the same as what, say, the CEO of a diet company or an obesity researcher means. I suspect that, for you, a diet works if you lose a lot of weight and keep it off. If that's the case, I can tell you definitively, diets don't work. The diet company CEO might define works a little differently. For him or her, a diet may work if people lose any weight at all for any length of time. And for obesity researchers, a diet might work if test subjects lose slightly more weight than people who are not dieting. CEOs and obesity researchers say diets work because people do lose weight, and more weight than non-dieters, during the early months of most diets. Since the 1940s, hundreds of studies have shown that dieters lose an average of 5 to 15 pounds over the first 4 to 6 months on a diet. This seems to be the case no matter what type of diet you try, whether you go low-calorie, low-fat, or low-carb. or whether you attempt whatever fad diet is currently popular. There are diets that require you to fast for hours or days at a time, diets that require you to consume only liquids, diets that suggest you eat like a caveman, or even diets that restrict your food intake solely to grapefruit, cabbage soup, or Snickers bars. There are also diets that promise to publicly humiliate you if you fail, or jolt you with electric shocks whenever you attempt to eat certain foods. As recently as 2014, a doctor in the United States was sewing patches onto people's tongues to cause them stabbing pain whenever they ate. The CEOs and obesity researchers who support these different types of diets are not technically lying when they say their diets are effective, because diets do lead to weight loss in the short term. But there are two problems with saying these diets work. People don't lose enough weight, and they don't keep it off. What does it mean for a diet to work? Although it seems like a no-brainer to most dieters, it has been surprisingly difficult for the medical community to decide what constitutes a successful diet. Even deciding what counts as a normal weight is not as simple as you might think. The World Health Organization, WHO, currently classifies people's weights based on their body mass index, or BMI, which is a measure of weight that takes height into account. The use of BMI is controversial because the formula for calculating it is not based on any understanding of how height and weight relate to each other, and because people who have high muscle mass tend to get categorized as overweight despite having very little fat. Nevertheless, according to the WHO, the cutoff between what it calls normal weight and overweight is a BMI of 25, and between overweight and obese is 30. Anything under 18.5 is considered underweight. Originally, the goal of a diet was to achieve what was known as your ideal weight. Starting in the 1940s, this weight was determined by the height and weight tables in your doctor's office. They offered a heavier ideal weight for large-framed women than for medium-framed women, which is larger than the ideal for small-framed women. For most of us, it was difficult to look at these tables without concluding one must be large-framed. According to these ideal height and weight tables, which have been criticized for being methodologically flawed and have been abandoned by researchers, an average height woman, 5 feet 5 inches tall, should weigh between 117 and 130 pounds if she is small-framed, and from 137 to 155 pounds if she is large-framed. The problem was, obese people tended to start diets weighing well above these somewhat unrealistic ideal ranges, and they rarely lost enough weight to reach them. Eventually, researchers and physicians realized this, and they did the only thing they could do to increase the number of successful dieters. They changed the definition of success to one that was easier to achieve, which was losing 40 pounds. It's like a pole vaulter lowering the bar when he realizes he cannot leap over it where it is. According to an influential review from the 1950s, however, 95% of dieters failed to achieve this standard as well. The response from the medical community was simply to lower the bar again. So for the next several decades, a diet that resulted in weight loss of 20 pounds was considered a success. Of course, a 20-pound weight loss means something very different to a 300-pound man than it does to a 100-pound girl, and in the 1970s, researchers, quite sensibly, started describing weight loss goals in relation to a person's starting weight, and later included a person's height in the calculation as well. Stated in these terms, losing 10% of one's starting weight was considered a successful diet. Only about 20% of dieters managed to achieve that goal, though, and in 1995, the Institute of Medicine lowered the bar again. They decided that the goal of weight loss programs would be to lose 5% of one's starting weight, which is just 10 pounds for a 200-pound person. At this point, our pole vaulter probably no longer needs the pole to clear the bar. Although researchers have continually lowered their standards, dieters have not lowered theirs. Not one dieter in a survey of 130 dieters said he would be satisfied with a 5% weight loss, and only one said he would be satisfied with a 10% weight loss. Heartbreaking evidence of dieters' high and unfulfilled standards comes from a study that surveyed 60 obese women about their weight loss goals when they started a new diet, and then checked in with them a year later to see how much weight they lost. When they were surveyed before the diet, the women selected their goal weight for the diet, and then listed their dream weight, their acceptable weight, defined as a weight they could accept even though they would not be happy with it, and a weight that would be considered their disappointed weight, one that they could not view as successful in any way, although less than their current weight. The women started the diet weighing an average of 218 pounds, and their goal was to lose more than 70 pounds. They defined their acceptable weight loss as losing 55 pounds and said they would be disappointed if they lost less than 38 pounds. In fact, the women on this diet lost an average of 36 pounds, making this an incredibly successful diet compared to the ones I summarized earlier, which averaged a 15-pound weight loss. But despite the comparative success of these women, very few were satisfied with the outcome. Ideal weight, 0%. Dream weight, 0%. Goal weight, 10%. Acceptable weight, 25%. Disappointed weight, 20%. Failed to reach disappointed weight, 45%. None of the women achieved the weight those height and weight tables would have defined as ideal back in the 1940s. None achieved her dream weight, and only 9% achieved their goal weight. 24% of the women achieved their acceptable weight, and 20% achieved their disappointed weight. That means that 47% of the women, nearly half, did not even lose enough weight to reach their disappointed weight. That's the first reason why we can't say that diets work. Although people nearly always lose enough weight for researchers to consider the diet successful, they rarely lose enough weight to satisfy themselves. The second reason why we can't say diets work is that dieters do not keep off the weight that they lose. Do diets work in the long term? For most dieters, the goal is not to lose weight temporarily, nor is it to remain on a strict diet their entire life. Yet for much of the last century, researchers focused primarily on the results from the first 3 to 6 months of diets, the part of the diet where a small amount of weight is lost relatively quickly, but did not track participants for much longer. Do dieters continue to lose weight? Does some of the lost weight return? Do some dieters gain back more weight than they lost? These important questions about diets have not been examined in most diet studies. Perhaps not surprisingly, commercial diet companies like Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, or Nutrisystem, which could provide a wealth of information on their clients' weight changes over many years, claim they are unable to collect long-term data on the effectiveness of their diets. Which raises the question, unable or unwilling? In the 1990s, when the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, began to increase its scrutiny of the weight loss industry's marketing practices, it asked a panel of experts to create guidelines for advertising weight loss products. This expert panel included representatives from several commercial diet programs, and those representatives insisted that advertisements should not have to include information about the effectiveness of a program. They said they would not offer data on the efficacy of their diets in the short term or the long term, or even the number of people who completed their programs after starting them, which are pretty much the exact facts potential customers would want to know. The representatives of the diet programs gave amazingly unconvincing reasons for why they should not have to provide this information. First, they argued that it was too costly and difficult to collect such information, even though many of them already had the information on hand. Second, they said, dieters don't need this information because they have had lots of experience with diets and are already very knowledgeable about them. Their third argument, however, was the most illuminating. They said, as recorded in the FTC report, dieters will be discouraged if they are provided with realistic outcome data. This was nothing less than an admission that their programs were not effective. The diet companies won the battle. They still do not have to disclose any of this information in their ads. But their unwillingness to report on whether their diets are effective makes it clear that they do not have much confidence in their diets, and they don't want you to know it. If their products were effective in leading to long-term weight loss, of course, they would soon put themselves out of business. These companies count on repeat customers for their very existence. Richard Samber, the longtime financial chairman of Weight Watchers, likened dieting to playing the lottery. If you don't win, you play it again. Maybe you'll win the second time. When asked how the business could be successful when only 16% of customers maintained their weight loss, he said, "It's successful because the other 84% have to come back and do it again. That's where your business comes from." And come back they do. As stated in Weight Watchers' business plan, our members have historically demonstrated a consistent pattern of repeat enrollment over a number of years. On average, our members have enrolled in 4 separate program cycles. Clearly, if long-term weight loss were achieved, their members would not need to re-enroll. The evidence. Although diet studies have been published regularly in the scientific literature since the 1920s, very few long-term follow-up studies of diets were conducted before the 1990s, and not many have been published since then. Tracking dieters in the years after a diet ends is crucial, because what happens after a diet ends, as most dieters know, is that the lost weight returns. The more time that passes, the more weight is regained. In one study, for example, a group of obese people volunteered to be starved in a hospital for about 38 days. After the starvation period, they were tracked for varying lengths of time. Among those who were followed for less than 2 years, 23% gained back more weight than they had lost. Among those who were followed for 2 or more years, 83% gained back more weight than they lost. Even in the studies that tracked people for the longest periods of time, 4 or 5 years, the amount of weight regained doesn't appear to level off. This is important because it suggests that if people were followed for even longer, they may be found to have kept gaining weight. Researchers imply that their participants' weight at the end of a study is the most they'll weigh, but the end of a diet study simply means that researchers will no longer see how much more weight participants gain. It doesn't mean that participants will stop gaining weight. To find out how effective diets are in the long term, the graduate students in my Psychology of Eating seminar and I decided to track down every study that followed dieters for at least 2 years after a diet began. During class discussion one day, we had concluded that what really mattered about diets was keeping the weight off, not just taking the weight off, and we were curious to find out what the research showed. We assumed there would be many articles that reviewed the research on this topic, because no matter how esoteric or narrow the research question, a paper reviewing it always seems to already exist. In this case, with such a straightforward, obvious, to us, and important question, in a field with huge amounts of research, we were shocked to find that there was no such review. So we did it ourselves. Had we known what a massive undertaking this seemingly simple project would be, we probably would have convinced ourselves not to bother. Being naive about the research on dieting, we went for it. Most diet studies are conducted by researchers who have a vested interest in a particular outcome. I'm not saying that diet researchers would purposely tilt their findings toward showing diets work, but despite one's best intentions, bias does creep into research. It's true for all of us researchers all of the time, so not having a preference for any particular outcome in this project helped us in our effort to look at the research as objectively as possible. We hunted through the research for studies that tracked participants for at least 2 years after they started a diet, and that used the gold standard research design, called a randomized controlled trial. This kind of study assigns participants to either be put on a diet right away or be waitlisted to go on the diet sometime in the distant future. The researchers can then compare the results of these two groups over time. The crucial factor that separates randomized controlled trials from other kinds of studies is that neither the participants nor the researchers have any control over whether the participants are assigned to the diet or to the wait list. It is done randomly. Although it may seem counterintuitive, this makes the groups as similar to each other as possible. If participants picked their groups, those who were most motivated and eager to diet would select the diet condition, and those less interested would put themselves on the waiting list. It wouldn't really be fair to compare these two groups to each other, because they would each start out with different kinds of people. There are many hundreds of diet studies, but even with 6 of us hunting through them thoroughly, we were able to find only 21 studies that satisfied our criteria. The diets in these studies varied from 800 calorie a day, very low calorie diets to low calorie, low fat, low carbohydrate, or combinations of these, and several also included other dietary changes, such as reduced sodium, reduced cholesterol, or reduced alcohol. Some diets featured support services as well, such as group counseling or weekly phone calls. The studies we looked at ranged from 2 to 10 years, lasting an average of 3.6 years, and we found that, at the end of that time, dieters had managed to keep off, on average, a measly 2 pounds. Nearly half of the participants, or about 40%, actually weighed more at the follow-up than before they went on the diet. Obesity researchers know that dieters keep off only a small amount of weight, but they justify these small weight losses by suggesting that these individuals would surely have gained lots of weight if they had not participated in the diet. That's a perfectly reasonable possibility to consider. The type of study we required in our review, the randomized controlled trial, is set up to test that very question, and we found that this was clearly not the case. Participants in the no-diet conditions of these studies gained an average of just 1 pound. Dieters went through all that effort and self-denial, and in the end, they weighed only the tiniest bit, 3 pounds, less than the non-dieters. Now for the really bad news. The truth is, most diets are probably even less successful than these gloomy findings suggest. The results I just described almost certainly inflate the success of these diets. Despite using the gold standard of research design, these studies have 3 serious flaws that are mostly unavoidable, that tilt them toward showing that diets work. Each of these flaws adds to the false impression that people can keep off the weight they lose. The first of these flaws is that the people who start and finish these studies are not necessarily typical dieters. Many people who volunteer to participate in weight loss studies are rejected from participating before the study begins. In some studies, for example, researchers only allow people to join if they are able to diet successfully in a tryout period for a month or more before the study starts. In those cases, the people who struggle...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?